Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Sobhana Jaya-Madhavan, and I'm the Associate Vice President of External Relations at Simon Fraser University. It's an honor to be the moderator for today's esteemed panel. I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Musqueam, and Coquitlam peoples. We really appreciate your time this afternoon. We may be involved in Parkinson's research or innovation, or we may be a care partner, a service provider, or a caregiver. We may have Parkinson's ourselves or love someone with Parkinson's. Irrespective of why we're here today, as we get ready to celebrate World Parkinson's Day this month, we should all be very concerned about a fact. Parkinson's is already considered to be the fastest growing neurological disorder in the world. We do not have a cure as yet, and the progression of the disease cannot be halted at this time. While there is a great deal of research happening around the world, including here in British Columbia, and factors from genetic to environmental contaminants are being studied and linked to the disease, there is an urgency to get answers and find meaningful and sustainable solutions in a collaborative way. So without much ado, I'm going to request our esteemed panelists, Dr. Anish Kanungo, Dr. Alexandra Greenhill, Bob Devitt, Susan Richards de Wit, Dr. Debashis Chanda, and Dr. Frank Lee, to take a minute or two to introduce themselves and share their passion for Parkinson's with us. I'd like to start with Dr. Anish Kanungo.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Kanungo. I'm one of the movement disorder neurologists who works at Fraser Health Movement Disorder Clinic. Our clinic is primarily located at the Jim Pattison Center, but as those of you who are patients of one of myself or Dr. David Ridds or Dr. Claire Hinnell will know that we often see patients in other locations as well so that we can spread ourselves across the Lower Mainland. At the clinic, we offer a wide array of multidisciplinary support, including physiotherapy, occupational therapy, social work, dietitian, and speech and language pathologist. We also have a clinic nurse, Robbie, who is an integral member of our team and is involved in following patients as well as starting patients on new therapies such as apomorphine, which we've only just begun to start. Throughout the Lower Mainland, we also partner up with the UBC Movement Disorder Clinic and the doctors there, as well as the UBC Deep Brain Stimulation Clinic and Dr. Christopher Honey there to provide care to patients with Parkinson's throughout the Lower Mainland. If you do have Parkinson's, or you think you do, or you have a loved one who does, and you're in the Lower Mainland, anywhere from Richmond to Burnaby down to Surrey and through down into Abbotsford, Chilliwack, please have your family doctor send a referral to our clinic and we'll be happy to see you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kanungo, especially for the last part around the referral, which I'm sure is very helpful to a lot of people who are joining us today. Over to Dr. Alexandra Greenhill.
Hello, everyone. My pleasure to be here. I am a family physician, a former occupational therapist, and a researcher in the past around Parkinson's disease. And I'm now focused on figuring out a big challenge in our healthcare system, which is how do you get the system to work as a system and connect across all of the different services and providers supporting patients in daily life. So how can we improve and use technology to offer virtual care collaboration in order to better support people and also use the data to discover new ways of helping?
Thank you, Dr. Greenhill. I'm sure there's a lot of people participating today who'd like to know how to get the system to work as a system. So look forward to that conversation. And now over to Bob Devitt.
Thank you, Sobhana, and thank you for inviting me to this panel today. It's a great honor for me. My interest in the topic is unfortunately personal. I was diagnosed with Parkinson's young onset in 2014 at the age of 46. At the time, I knew little about the condition, and now I know, unfortunately, quite a bit. So I'll try to share some of that today. My history with SFU, I have 2 degrees from SFU, an undergrad in business and a master's in economics. And I met my wife today, actually was headed to do a PhD in economics in the UK, but unfortunately she wouldn't follow me to England. So I had to take a pause, where I then got a job at SFU in the tech transfer office, where I reported to your colleague, Joanne Curry. She was my first boss at SFU. And while I was at SFU, I got involved with tech entrepreneurship. I helped co-found a company called Canadian Leadership Design with Tim Collins, which then got me into the tech entrepreneurship area, which I didn't go back and do a PhD, but it led me to a career in tech transfer and tech commercialization and investment. So since being diagnosed with Parkinson's, I've been looking for ways to repurpose that experience and those connections to try to find, well, ideally a cure, but at least to help improve the lives of people with Parkinson's. And so that's why I'm so glad to be part of this panel today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob. And it adds such tremendous value to any dialogue or conversation or problem solving when personal stories can be part of that conversation. So I appreciate you being here today. And over to Susan Richards de Wit.
Thank you, Sobhana. Thank you for having us all here today. I'm a management consultant and I specialize in strategic partnerships. And when Bob was diagnosed with Parkinson's, one of my interests was taking what I do and applying it, seeing what I can do to wrap supports around Parkinson's to minimize suffering and bring people together with experts. So part of that has been some of the people I've helped you to bring together today. Look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thanks for all the efforts to bring this great group together today. Over to Dr. Debashis Chanda from the US.
First of all, let me thank you for this wonderful opportunity. I'm from University of Central Florida. I'm a professor, but my background in physics, so I'm a physicist. So I will not have a depth knowledge about Parkinson's disease. But the goal of my research, one of the goals is that we are very keen into understanding various neurotransmitters, and can we develop a blood test for that? You know, we see blood tests for people with high blood sugar, but a mental disorder, we don't have anything very simple like that for a person to monitor at home. Say somebody feeling depressed or not feeling happy, or of course Parkinson, Alzheimer, all those disorders are there. So that's kind of triggered that interest that can we detect a neurotransmitter directly from blood, and that we started around 2015. I was still joined University of Central Florida as a junior faculty then, but since then grew. And the goal is to that project that we wanted to take a simple blood drop and trying to quantify how much dopamine is there. And dopamine being still an elusive molecule, actually, even many journal paper being written, but we as humans still know very little about it. Means what is the mechanism it transfers to the brain, to the body, the way it fluctuates throughout our day. People and various pharmaceutical company came up with the medicine, but those are based on symptoms, not followed exact science method of correlating a neurotransmitter or brain activity with that. So with that being said, yeah, our goal is to develop that, and we demonstrated that we have ability to detect dopamine as a first target molecule. And now we are kind of working with various folks to see whether we can make it more a system level integration to take it to a just outside of my labs. I will not be too optimistic by saying that it could be available in CVS and Walgreens USA, but if it is still be done outside of my lab and help, I think the primary goal will be to work with physicians and doctors. They can actually correlate that missing link of dopamine fluctuation and the brain health. That will be immense impact to the society if we can even do so. And the next step to going really to the patient's level. I think if even a doctor's office could do so over years or few years, that's at the big impact. So I think I'm looking forward to the panel discussion and learning also new thing about Parkinson today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chanda. I think you touched on a few important things that we're going to explore in greater depth, and one of them is knowledge translation. What happens in the research lab? How do we get it into clinical practice and impact patient experiences? So thank you for that. And last but not the least, Dr. Frank Lee.
Hi, everyone. My name is Frank Lee, and I'd like to thank for this invitation to this panel discussion. And I'm currently an associate professor here at SFU in the Faculty of Health Sciences. I'm also the director of the graduate program here at FHS, and my lab is by trade. I'm a molecular neurobiologist, and as it ties with Dr. Chanda, my focus is on the dopamine system, dopamine receptors, dopamine transporters, and we're looking at how various different factors affect the function of these proteins and how that can contribute to the pathophysiology of Parkinson's disease. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So I think everyone who's participating in this event today, I think is getting a sense or beginning to get a sense of how rich this conversation is going to be. We're going to be talking about research, we're going to be talking about innovations, we're going to be talking about gaps and needs, and then of course, patient experiences, because at the end of it all, it's about putting the patient at the center and overall improving the lives of people and the experiences we have at both an individual and collective level. So I'm going to dive right into the conversation, the most exciting part of today. And once again, thank you all for being here. But before we get started, I just want to mention one or two very important housekeeping points here. At the bottom of your screen, you will see that there is a chat and a Q&A button there. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat function, and one of my teammates will definitely help you out. If you have a question for the panel member, you can post that question through the Q&A function here, and you can post the question anonymously because sometimes people prefer to do that, or you could put your name. You could also specifically ask for a panel member to answer the question. We do have only about an hour and a quarter left, so it is a bit of a tight time frame, but I will do my very best to make sure that this conversation is rich, and at the end of it, we do have some time for some interaction with the panelists. So I'm going to kickstart the panel discussion with Dr. Kanungo. Dr. Kanungo, Parkinson's disease was first medically described as a neurological syndrome by James Parkinson in 1817, though there's information suggesting that it was mentioned way before 1817. Why is it that in 2021, we are still challenged by effective testing, timely diagnosis, early intervention, and effective treatments?
So Parkinson's disease is a multi-system disorder. We think of it mostly as a neurological condition, but Parkinson's disease can affect other aspects of human health as well. To give an example of that, most patients with Parkinson's will lose about 20 pounds at the start of their diagnosis, indicating that there might be some sort of metabolic aspect to the disease that has been previously under-recognized. Dopamine is a molecule that circulates throughout our body. Patients who take levodopa or L-dopa will know that they can convert some of the levodopa into dopamine peripherally. And this is why we give levodopa with carbidopa, which helps to prevent that peripheral conversion. You have dopamine receptors everywhere. You have them on your blood vessels, you have them on your gut. You certainly, of course, have them in your brain and the nigrostriatal system. So when dopamine levels fall, then we get a multi-system disorder. Now, the reason why why dopamine neurons and producing neurons are the ones that are targeted the most, quite frankly, we don't really know that. We have some idea of the pathophysiology beginning in the gut with this prion-like movement of the misfolded synuclein protein, which spreads its way from the enteric nervous system up the vagus nerve into the brainstem, where it starts to settle in the substantia nigra, where the dopamine-producing neurons are located. As time goes on, the misfolded protein that causes damage to these brain cells moves up to the striatum, where the dopamine responsive brain cells are, and then from there on can move up into the cortex and affect things like higher thought and cognition. But it's not just a dopamine disorder. People who have tremor will appreciate the fact that if you put them on an anticholinergic medication, that they will have less tremor. So there are other neurotransmitters involved in dopamine as well, in Parkinson's as well. There are many flavors of Parkinson's disease. There are many symptoms. There are non-motor symptoms and there are the traditional motor symptoms. And people get different combinations of these different symptoms to create their own individualistic flavor. There are different rates at which the disease progresses. There are different responses to treatment. So it's a very variable, multi-system, multifaceted disorder. And I think that goes towards answering the question of why do we have a hard time diagnosing it early? A lot of the early symptoms that we see in people with Parkinson's disease in retrospect are things like loss of smell or anosmia, constipation. But those are symptoms that can happen in a lot of different other conditions as well, right? If you've broken your nose, you might notice that you have loss of smell. If you got COVID-19, you might notice loss of smell. So those early symptoms that would give us preclinical indication that the person's going to develop Parkinson's, those early symptoms are often missed or not really appreciated until in retrospect, the neurologist asks the person, so what about this and this and this and this? And then you say, oh yeah, I have all of those things. And that's when it gets recognized. A study that was reported at the Movement Disorder Society meeting in Nice a couple of years ago, where they were looking at patients who have a family history of Parkinson's disease and following them out for a long period of time. And they were looking for the development of loss of smell and constipation. Those that developed those two symptoms went on to have what we know as a dopamine amine transporter test, or a DAT scan, where we give a radio-labeled nucleotide to the brain to see what's the uptake of that in the areas of the brain that respond to dopamine. And that's a very good test that can actually tell you if a person's going to develop Parkinsonism. About 65% of those people who had loss of smell and constipation developed Parkinsonism. So we are moving towards a point where we can have some sort of early preclinical readout of Parkinson's, but it's a difficult and challenging task.
Thank you so much. That detailed kind of explanation, though it has a lot of medical information, I think it just teases out how complex it is. And while people might be frustrated, why don't we have a cure? Or why can't someone just tell us if we have Parkinson's or not? It's not that simple, which leads me to ask Dr. Greenhill the next question, which is, from a physician's perspective, what is the impact of a fragmented healthcare system on the patient, the family, and society at large? And Dr. Greenhill, in your opinion, what should be done in the short and long term to ensure a more coordinated and integrated healthcare system that puts the patient at the center?
Well, putting the patient at the center is absolutely key. And even if we can start thinking of the patient not just as a patient, which by definition is centered on the disease that they have, but as a person, because this obviously happens to someone who has a job to do, they have interests, they have a life, they have loved ones. And the part that we often engage with in calling them patient is the disease part, but getting to know who are they and what is important to them and how can we adjust our medical knowledge to enable them to continue to live the life for the fullest is probably the most important thing we can do. And in most of the time when someone is diagnosed with Parkinson, there's many other people who are affected and whose world also changes because they're the caregiver, they're the person who is going to experience the ups and downs of figuring out the right treatment in order because they're part of the life of that patient. And we also tend to forget that, unfortunately, people have pre-existing diseases before they're diagnosed with Parkinson's, and they may go on to develop other health conditions. And so how do we, as a family physician, you look at someone who's being treated at a specialty clinic and then has pre-existing issues or other issues, and how do we ensure all that communication happens? And unfortunately, it's 2021, but the way we do that right now is either verbally, or we send pieces of paper, or we fax things over and hope that the right information gets to the right person in the right moment. And it's time to start changing that, because the effort shouldn't be that dramatic for everyone involved, and it shouldn't rely on the best intentions or best capabilities of everyone, because especially patients who are diagnosed with a disease that is so overwhelming, they can be tired, they can be they have different education levels, and so we have a system that works for many because of individuals stepping up and doing the extra step of transferring the files, communicating the information, of caregivers. And I'm sure we're going to hear from Susan in a few minutes, stepping in and fighting for the ones that they love to receive the right services. But what about patients who don't have that ability? We should not have a system that leaves patients like that behind. There are articles, and I'm sure my colleagues can reference specifics as well, that show that when you provide specialized coordinated care, everyone wins. The patient, obviously, the caregivers, because their health is better and more appropriate. The experience of care is better, but ultimately our healthcare system and also our society, because people can be more productive and live a more fuller life and contribute to the economy and society in a better way.
Thank you so much, Dr. Greenhill. I think I mentioned to you the other day, I'm a social worker by trade, and my background was in child welfare for almost 20 years. And everything you've said here has resonated so much with me, because I remember, especially when I was a frontline child protection social worker, more than 50% of my time was spent advocating and fighting for youth and children in care. Just asking the right hand to recognize there's a left hand and talk to one another, so that the child and the youth doesn't fall through the cracks. So thank you for raising those very important points. And it's a great segue over to Bob. Bob, as someone who's experiencing early onset Parkinson's, could you share your journey from the point of noticing symptoms to getting a diagnosis and refocusing your life? You touched on it in your introduction, but I would really appreciate if you could just share a bit more here.
Sure, I'd be happy to. One thing I just wanted to point out also is that Parkinson's affects each of us differently. So in my case, I received it early, so I have young onset. But even for people who have young onset, each of us have a different disease, basically a different constellation of symptoms. I first noticed my symptoms, my motor symptoms, about 5 years before I was diagnosed. One day I was just sitting waiting. Actually, I was in a waiting room, and I noticed my thumb start to twitch, which was unusual. And then it hadn't happened intermittently, but then I started to notice it more frequently. The next motor symptom I noticed was I was out for a run one day, and I noticed my left leg, which is that's another thing that people should know, that usually Parkinson's symptoms appear on one side before you get it on both sides. So I noticed my left leg was dragging, and I thought I had a back problem, but it turns out I didn't. As for non-motor symptoms, again, they can appear many years before, and you don't know what they are until later. But about 7 years pre-diagnosis, I had an issue with insomnia, so I couldn't sleep, which again is a Parkinson's related symptom. When I was diagnosed in 2014, my first reaction was utter shock and denial. I really didn't want to believe it. I ended up getting 4 second opinions, 2 of them from movement disorder specialists, which is, I'll come back to that later on, I think, in this webinar. But the next problem that I came to was how to share the information with other people. And I think that's, some people come out right away and broadcast that they've got the condition. Other people never tell anyone. In my case, it took us 3 years before we disclosed beyond just my wife, my mom, and my doctors. And once we did that, because one of the, I think, real challenges people face is the secrecy or not wanting to disclose. That causes stress, and the stress causes more symptoms or exacerbated symptoms, and then it becomes a vicious cycle. Once we disclosed to my professional network, then the next step was pulling back from that professional network, which I did 2 years ago, which has helped quite a lot in helping me manage my my symptoms and my condition. One of my life passions, as I mentioned earlier, is tech entrepreneurship. And beyond the ventures that I help directly myself, I sit on the board of New Ventures BC, and I also mentor students directly through SFU's Venture Connection and also through the Smolik Foundation here in Surrey. So again, I want to thank you, Sobhana, for bringing this panel together, and I'm looking forward to the other panelists' responses to some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Bob. I'm sure that there's many folks, participating in this event today who are either going through something themselves that makes them wonder if it's time to talk to their GP or get a referral to one of the clinics that Dr. Kanungo mentioned, or to even share with their partner or a loved one that something is happening in their lives. And you also touched on, the secrecy element, which I think is something that we definitely will talk about in a moment. But thanks again, Bob. And I'd like to ask a next question to Susan. Susan, as a care partner to someone with young onset Parkinson's, what would you say, knowing what you know now, is the most important thing for other care partners to know?
Thank you, Sobhana. Well, there's a lot to say. I think one of the first sort of mistakes and then corrections that we made was attending medical appointments, having somebody that's consistently attending medical appointments with you. And at the beginning, obviously, Bob is still, can drive himself around and do his own thing, even now, years later. But it was someone there taking notes. I actually have a notebook that I bring and take notes. And a lot of people that we now have a network of people with young onset Parkinson's, a lot of them males, some of them up in regions that are, living on their own. And I have concern about those people more so because it is important to have that team around you, and especially somebody that consistently is part of at least your medical appointments, because what I've found is that, well, for Bob, but I've noticed it with other Parkinson's patients, they don't always remember or remember what their medications were, or what the names of them were, what the quantities were, or they don't always notice what their symptoms are. So some of the drug-related symptoms or Parkinson's-related symptoms, I've taken videos of Bob when we've been out somewhere to show him, this is what your limb is doing, or this is what, they're not always, can't sense it. So to try not to be isolated. I think Parkinson's, there's this tendency to want to sort of hide. There's anxiety around showing the symptoms and wrapping that team around you. Those are big.
Thank you so much, Susan. Again, like Bob, the personal sharing, I think, is going to be so valuable to so many people. I already see, questions and comments where individuals are sharing they have a loved one with Parkinson's and asking questions. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to ask the next question to Dr. Debashis Chanda. What is your focus in Parkinson's related research? You did speak about it at the beginning, but I just want to know what made you get involved in this aspect. And when you look at the different types of research being done in universities connected to Parkinson's in different parts of the world, why do you think your area of research is important and it's important to work in that space?
Actually, being a physicist, as a group, we are looking into how can you use optics and various optoelectronics techniques we are developing in the lab for more meaningful molecules. When I started my career, I was just picking up a molecule A and molecule B and trying to see whether they have any sensitivity towards that. But then when I progressed in my professorship in the University of Central Florida, then we started looking into more relevant molecule which can attach to a more impactful results. And I think already we know that with this discussion that Parkinson being such a one of the critical disease coming forward, and one of my friend who graduated from UCF here at the age of 41 or 40s around, now he's having a very bad progression into Parkinson. So we kind of came across him and then keep reading about that is there any way we can diagnose? And I think Bob already touched upon that. He may have already had the onset even a few years ago, which he may not have noticed. So then we kind of started looking into dopamine as a molecule that, and then all the literature search still today shows that there are multiple ways dopamine is generated and absorbed in the body, but there is no direct correlation of because the way brain functions and how the blood-brain barrier works, that the dopamine doesn't like come through what is generated in the brain, because the barrier actually doesn't allow the dopamine to come through to the body. So so there are all this uncertainty kind of helped us to zoom into a molecule like dopamine to see we can develop an optical chip, simple chip where you can draw a blood like a morning blood sugar testing, and the chip itself separate blood and plasma, and a light beam comes in and reads that and reflects back. So that's kind of what it is. At the beginning, again, I was not very much attached emotionally or had any vision about Parkinson in that sense, which has changed last 7-8 months. I think we are now looking forward. I think Sushan came forward herself, tied me up with few other folks. So we're kind of now steering towards more of a Parkinson specific detection of neurotransmitters. So dopamine is one of them. And of course, we are looking into HVA, L-DOPA directly, epinephrine, all kinds of neurotransmitters we're looking into to see at some point we can give the doctors a platform so that they can generate this data, the daily variation of dopamine and how that affects personal behavior. Then over a year or so, or a few years from now, they can actually help chart out that the dopamine fluctuation in a body actually has these implications. So the whole goal was to develop a simple optical chip and simply a plate reader. The doctor's office mostly have no spectrometer and read through. So they draw blood and read through and get the measurement of dopamine. And of course, that will help us improve our understanding of Parkinson, will help us how Parkinson progress with time, and eventually maybe help the pharmaceutical companies to design better medication. Because again, we are not solving the problem. So my end actually looking into measuring the effect, but we're not solving the problem. So there's another aspect has to be done through more of a clean medical way or pharmaceutical way, where we need some medication or some other way, invasive or non-invasive way of addressing. But without being able to measure it, we are still in a kind of doing a guessing work, and a lot of guesswork. If you read journal paper after journal paper, I think we ourselves feel a little lost that if somebody asks me what is the mechanism of Parkinson and what is the relation of Parkinson with a neurotransmitter, I think the answer will be very vague actually. So we're saying that if we can come out with a system, an optoelectronic platform where we can empower the medical profession to really measure various neurotransmitters, that really will help Parkinson and related disease at some point.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I mean, we've only been into this conversation for about half an hour, and my God, there's so much to understand and unpack over here. You know, everything from research, the tech solutions that people are working on, and patient experiences and care partner experiences. So thank you so much for the detailed answers and for just unpacking, you know, these very complex issues for everybody here. I'd like to move on to Dr. Frank Lee. And I think Dr. Chanda touched on, you know, things happening in the lab, you know, having to move into, you know, reality where they begin to impact patients and clinicians. So Dr. Lee, my question to you is, why does it take so long, in your opinion, for research findings to become part of clinical practice? And what are your views on some of the checks and balances that need to be in place while we work on quickening or speeding up the knowledge transfer from research labs to spaces where patients and clinicians can benefit from it?
Sure. So I think, you know, when we read in the news or read articles about certain research findings, we're just seeing the surface of it. And what the public doesn't see is all the failed experiments, the amount of failed experiments that had led to those discoveries. And so a lot of times it may take years to develop the reagents to get to the point where you're able to ask that important scientific question, to test your hypothesis, to get to that result. And so I think there's a time there that is spent in really refining the question, refining your techniques. And sometimes the technology is not available till much later on. And so there's delays in that. And in terms of checks and balances, I think also, I'm not a clinician myself, but in my opinion, there is a necessary requirement for checks and balances that we make sure that any discoveries that are made, that we carefully document, we carefully control the outcomes in a clinical setting. And so typically, clinical trials will take 7 years, and they go through various different stages to make sure that it's safe and that we're seeing the results that we want to see, and that we're controlling it so that we have the proper control so that what we're seeing is actually real. And so I think those checks and balances are necessary for the development of any type of therapeutic.
Thank you so much. I think that's really helpful in kind of giving everyone a sense of why things take time. And I think with the recent pandemic, we've all learned, when we try to shorten the time it takes to develop something such as a vaccine, the pros and cons of it, and then managing citizen expectations and all other aspects that we all have to encounter. I'd like to go back to Dr. Kanungo with my next question. Dr. Kanungo, acceptance of the diagnosis and coming to terms with the diagnosis is such a critical aspect of any disease. And so from your experiences with patients with Parkinson's, what can you tell us about this? And what can patients and care partners or caregivers do to have a more successful or better outcomes in terms of disease management?
In terms of your first question, in terms of when the diagnosis is given, you kind of see two groups of patients. One, we have Bob here, who's got early onset Parkinson's, which is a much more rare thing that we would see clinically. Fortunately, early onset Parkinson's is not very common. But if you're 40 years old or in your 40s when you get a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease, that seems so unrealistic, because for the most part, we think of Parkinson's as a disease that where its greatest risk factor is age. As you go through the decades, your risk of developing Parkinson's increases by 10% per decade. Understandably, Bob, his reaction to getting a diagnosis of Parkinson's and seeking a second opinion was totally justified, because that has such a life-altering effect on what do you do, how do you plan your career out, when do you retire, these kinds of things. The vast majority of people that I will see with a new diagnosis of Parkinson's disease are typically over the age of 60, usually between their late 60s into their 70s. And for the most part, most of them have gone 1 or 2 years and had fairly significant progression in those first couple of years of disease onset, to the point where it's kind of obvious when they come in, a lot of them are even expecting a diagnosis. With the advent, of course, of Dr. Google, a lot of people will search up their symptoms. And so a lot of people come in with the idea that maybe this is their problem. In terms of that expectation of what is the diagnosis, how do they respond? For the most part, I would say most people are quite accepting of the diagnosis. And the challenges that come with that diagnosis. Now, your second question, sorry, I didn't fully comprehend the gist of it.
Just wondering, from what you have seen over the years, is there something or a set of things that the patient and the care partner or caregivers can do to make the acceptance happen and help them manage the disease and probably treatment outcomes a little bit better? Right.
Okay. So again, going back to the concept that, the disease presentation and progression is highly variable. The average person with Parkinson's disease who gets it caught early on, maybe some mild dragging of the foot, maybe some tremor, maybe a little bit of stiffness that is more unilateral. For the vast majority of patients, the question emerges, okay, well, do I start treatment right away? understanding that all of the treatments that we have are purely symptomatic. What they do is they raise the level of dopamine stimulation, and that is the predominant neuropeptide that is missing in this disease. Raising the stimulation level helps to bring that abnormal patterning of movement that leads to slowness and stiffness and tremor back in line into a more normal pattern of movement. But if it's early enough and the symptoms are non-bothersome, a lot of patients will opt not to start treatment once they understand fully that the medications we have do not affect the underlying disease pathophysiology. This misfolded protein that causes damage to the dopamine-producing neurons doesn't get affected really by the medications that we prescribe. So if you start the medications early, you're not going to lose the effectiveness of the medications later. It's not going to make your disease progress any faster than it was already programmed to do. If you wait 6 months and come back for a follow-up and see how things are after 6 months, you're not going to miss out on anything either. The medications do not have a disease-modifying effect. So a lot of the patients who I see with early symptoms who are not significantly compromised to the point where, you know, I'm not worried that they're going to fall if I don't start them on medication right away. Those patients often decide not to start medication, just to wait until the symptoms are more bothersome. When you look at what actually changes once you start people on treatment, what changes is their quality of life. The quality of life, we measure that with a measure called QALYs. In studies that have looked at this in patients with Parkinson's, the difference is the quality of life that that person experiences. That presupposes that they're actually bothered by their symptoms. If they're not bothered by their symptoms, the medications are not going to improve their quality of life. So if their symptoms are early and non-bothersome and mild, there's no need to rush out and start medication right away. The biggest thing, though, that in terms of starting, you know, the journey of Parkinson's and facing that with the caregiver and with the family and with the care partners, is getting them into an active exercise program. There is only one study that has been shown to have a disease-modifying effect, and that was the one where we got people to be more active. By comparison to the couch potatoes, those who were more active were on far less medication after several years of treatment and had fewer motor symptoms than those who were stagnant and were couch potatoes. So really the biggest thing to wrap your head around is this is not a disease that you become more kind of at a standstill. This is a disease where you get out and you become more active. We use the medications to help you do that, but the rest is kind of up to the individual.
Thank you so much. I just want to acknowledge to the participants, thank you so much for all the questions that you're posting on the Q&A, and I will get to them once I've asked at least, you know, the second question to all of the panelists, because I think there's some rich conversations that need to happen here, and then we'll get to your questions and try to get to most of them at least. But thanks again. Dr. Greenhill, my second question to you is, there is often a serious disconnect between what decision makers do and what is really needed from a patient or a clinician perspective. And also a disconnect that you touched on when we talked the other day between research and clinical practice and vice versa. Could you elaborate a little bit on this and share your views on how best to bridge this gap?
Well, thank you for that question. And I think that, you know, one of the ways we can bridge the gap is through conversations like these, where there should be no conversation about me without me, right? And so we've started inviting patients and family members into the decision-making conversations because we are all so full of good intentions and we imagine what people want as opposed to listening to what they need. And so I've heard of Dr. Kanungo's fight to establish that movement disorder clinic because it was so necessary. But look at the spread of geography that is being covered and the degree to which before COVID, everyone was required to travel in to be assessed. And we've suddenly realized that, oh, wait a second, virtual also works. We've tried telling decision makers that virtual works for the last 10 years, that it was affordable, it was safe, that with safeguards, you can evaluate somebody so that they don't have to get in a car and drive for 4 hours to be seen. but that message was not resonating. And so it's so important to partner with the Parkinson's foundations, patient groups, the caregiver organizations, and really have a dialogue, because not everything that the patients and families want is desirable or medically educated or has evidence behind it. It's easy to sort of grasp at straws and go after all kinds of ideas that people have invented around herbs or special rituals that may help, because when you feel like there is no cure, why not try something? Well, sometimes these things do have side effects, so they have harmful effects, and we should study and we should collaborate, but we should have a dialogue that includes the patients and the caregivers into the decisions of what's needed, and listen to the specialists that require this, and also listen to the family physicians. The question was asked earlier, how do patients deal with this? I think a large number of patients and their family become depressed, and they become clinically depressed. And until you can address the clinical depression, it's hard to sort out how much of this is Parkinson's disease symptoms versus depression. But in either case, they don't get off the couch, they don't exercise. And what Dr. Kanungo was recommending, I see in clinical practice, is patients who remain active do well, but that implies their spouse also getting out and being active, so that they get the incitement to get moving, because sometimes either the diagnosis itself has caused the depression, or there's something about Parkinson that makes you just less excited to move. And it takes that strong advocate in your life to get you to do the right thing.
Thank you so much. You've touched on so many things, and I really wish we had 3 hours instead of an hour and a half, because so much of this could be unpacked further. And my next question is to Bob. Bob, I'm sure that as you're listening to this, you sort of say, hey, this is about me. This is my story that you're sort of actually talking about. And I'm kind of curious, and I'm sure many people who have joined us today are curious. Did the healthcare system work for you? And this is at the start where, you noticed your symptoms and you were seeking help. And what would have, looking back, what would have made the journey easier for you? And then currently, would you say the healthcare system is working for you?
Right. I guess the quick answer is yes, which I'm happy to say. But I have a few advantages that others I've met don't have. One, first of all, I have a superpower. It's called my wife, Susan, having an advocate, which is super important. The other thing that I was lucky to have, was a family doctor who, it's not Dr. Greenhill, but someone like Dr. Greenhill who's well connected and could make the right referrals to the right experts. In particular, getting access to a movement disorder specialist like Dr. Kanungo early, I think is critical. And when you talk about the system itself, if you look around the province, I think that's one of the issues, is that there are a lot of Parkinson's patients and not as many movement disorder specialists. And I know that Dr. Kanungo mentioned that there's referrals available. However, I keep bumping into people who are being treated by sometimes a neurologist if they're lucky, or maybe not even a neurologist, which I think doesn't constitute proper care. So I think, one of the challenges we have, if you don't live in a big city, like I'm lucky to, and have access to a doctor and have a care partner who's supportive, you're really at a disadvantage. So I think that we need to do more to communicate the resources that are available out to people with Parkinson's, and also address whether we have enough resources in the first place.
Thank you for that, Bob. I think the issue of isolation, depression, the importance of having a champion or advocate in your life, I think all of these things are such critical points, which takes me to Susan for our next question, which is, Susan, what would you like to see happen in the bigger picture for Parkinson's patients and their families? And in your opinion, in the short term especially, what is the one thing you'd say would improve the quality of life for all folks living with Parkinson's?
Thank you, Sobhana. I have two things down. One is, and they have to do with some of the experts that we've brought together today, because I think they have important things to contribute to Parkinson's. And one is the care coordination. So whether it's a young onset a patient like Bob, or someone living more remotely, or if you have an elder, like if you have a parent living across the country with Parkinson's, care coordination allows us to be united just like the internet does. So we should be able to securely share information. And, you know, when your loved one has missed an appointment, we can get a reminder on our phone across the country or across the world. So care coordination is really important to remove that isolation piece and connect us to the experts. We shouldn't have to live in cities to be connected. And the dopamine monitoring with Parkinson's, because the key medication they give, as has been mentioned today, is around the trying to balance dopamine. When dopamine's too high or dopamine's too low, both cause problems, numerous types of problems, and some can be very serious. So with the dopamine monitoring, if we have a point of care device, like Dr. Chanda is talking about, then we can personalize care, we can personalize medications. And I think some of that dopamine monitoring may start in labs. I know we have some interest in the Netherlands with a world-renowned researcher wanting to use this device. And I think if we can get that to market, we can make a difference on, I think, alleviating some of the suffering that currently happens because of dopamine fluctuations.
Thank you for that, Susan. I think really important, which is a great segue to Dr. Chanda, for whom I have this question. What are some of the challenges you and other researchers like yourselves are facing from an innovation perspective in doing the kind of research you're involved in? And do you have any thoughts, any suggestions for how they can be overcome, especially within an academic setting?
I think from a researcher point of view, I think the biggest challenge we are facing right now, that we need to create that awareness that this is an important area of research. And for me in particular, I am heavily funded through Department of Defense in USA. So that takes majority of my focus. So the point I'm trying to see that we need to create awareness that government has to see that this is a really exciting research area, not for just for the science, but also for the societal need, that we need to have a point of care solution. And I think multiple times we heard that is not easily accessible to go to a specialist. And even in USA and Canada, both places, I did my PhD in University of Toronto, so I'm very aware of Canadian system that getting to referral. I still have the nightmare of my wife's problem with 8 months wait time. So 8 months wait time is even it is too bad. Even if somebody is suffering from something severe like Parkinson, and we don't know how to monitor say something like dopamine to adjust my medication, and things are becoming more virtual. I think that's also we are hearing now. Now, question is, can we empower local clinics, local healthcare providers to have a way to measure blood tests, and they can upload that information for people like Dr. Kanungo and higher up in the physician ladder to make a decision online. They can just diagnose and say so without the patient really being seen physically. So I see this is a big area to be, but it needs a bigger funding to be honest with that. Research, again, 98% failure. Each day we come back with a lot of gut that will solve a problem, and 98% of day go back, drive home with this feeling that one worthless person, all the experiment tried failed. But that's how human progress, and every innovation has that kind of story behind, and anything small we made, every innovation has that kind of issues that it takes long time, a lot of careful studies, and many failure, and then you get some success. So that we be saying that I think you need awareness so the government and private sector comes forward to invest on it. Like if I say I want building a new kind of infrared camera, I get easy money actually, just being said, and brings me money to my home. I'm a happy life. Money was never an issue, but when I'm saying that I need money to solve a Parkinson's disease problem, to create a point of care thing, then there are money, but issue I'm seeing that they will ask for a system. Now, if you go to a big pharmaceutical company, they say, do you have a system ready that I can test right now? But now from a lab to a going to Walgreens or some place where you can buy a system, there's a big disjoint. And we keep hearing again and again that this is a problem, that that those guys want a ready-made solution which they can purchase and then they will invest on you. So that's what the problem is, that something has to match that big gap, that is a cell phone took like many decades for Samsung or Apple to develop it. It's just not a magic. It took hundreds of years to invent all the small components which we're using today. It has all these billions of components inside, right? So same thing, we need to look for a point of care solution while we're talking about a very complex situation like a Parkinson or neurological health in general, that if we have to develop those kind of things, needs overall awareness, need bigger funding from government as well as private sector to bridge that. Some of the research going on at the lab level, how can I take it to the next level? I think with that said, probably that's the biggest challenge, not only myself, but lots of my colleagues and research group around the world faces.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Chanda. It's just fascinating. You know, you always think that researchers are sitting in fancy labs with a ton of money and PhD students and others just clamoring to come and work in your lab. And the reality is so different, isn't it, for many important areas of research, including Parkinson's, which takes me to Dr. Lee. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Chanda. So Dr. Lee, one of the questions I want to throw out at you is, we had a conversation about this the other day. There are a multitude of factors, and Dr. Kanungo in the very beginning touched on it too. There are a multitude of factors when it comes to understanding Parkinson's as a disease, genetic, environmental, et cetera, et cetera. Could you just touch on that and elaborate a little bit? And then I have a follow-up question to Susan.
Yeah, so Parkinson's disease, in terms of risk factors, I guess the number one risk factor, and it's been mentioned previously, is age. I think as an individual gets older, the prevalence of the disease gets higher. Another major factor to that, of course, is genetic components. In recent years, when I first started, only a handful of genes were identified to be linked to familial forms of Parkinson's disease. And that list has grown exponentially. And so we're starting to understand some of the key genes that are involved in developing Parkinson's disease, especially familial forms, inheritable forms of Parkinson's disease. And they all provide a clue as to what is actually happening in these neurons and what's causing the neurodegeneration that occurs in these dopaminergic neurons that lead to the onset of Parkinson's disease. So I think it's as technology develops, as our understanding of the various different components becomes elaborated, we identify these genes and how they play a role, the proteins that are generated play a role. I think we'll start to get a better understanding of the pathophysiology, and hopefully that will lead to a way of stopping the neurodegeneration and also identifying what may be the initial cause of the disorder.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Lee. Before I ask the next question to Susan, last night, quite late last night, one of our participants who's joined us today was kind enough to send me an article that came out in The Guardian recently about the so-called explosion of Parkinson's cases and the fact that we're sitting on an iceberg. And the focus of the article was on chemical contaminants in our environment. So a follow-up question here, Susan, is while there are varied opinions on this, could you share your thoughts on pesticides and chemical contaminants in the Parkinson's conversation?
Thank you, Shobna. Yes, well, I've been following the work of Dr. Bas Blom in Holland, and he's a neurologist, specializes in Parkinson's, and he's quite vocal about pesticides being a factor in Parkinson's. And I would encourage anyone interested in this area to have a look at his work. If you're on LinkedIn, follow him, Dr. Bas Blom. Have a look at, he's recently written a book on Parkinson's, co-written with the CEO of the Michael J. Fox Foundation. Have a look at what he's doing, what he has to say. He's the expert on that. So.
Thank you, Susan. I'm conscious of time, and I want to make sure that our participants who have taken the time and effort to be here today with us, we at least get to some of their questions, if not all. And one thing I can promise all of you, as I do with most of the panels I moderate, is I will make sure that I take a copy of all your questions, and the ones that we don't get to today, I will do my very best to get you an answer and email you in the next couple of days. So let's move on to some of the questions we have from our participants, and I'll do the best I can to address it to the right panel member here. So one of the questions we have that has been posted here anonymously is, my father had Parkinson's, a kind that does not show trembling. He passed away after a long process. His very early symptoms were loss of smell and taste, but this was realized later on, as the panelist mentioned. A question I have is there a possibility to get to a reliable diagnosis? And more importantly, is there a point to check where I may have the potential to get Parkinson's disease? I'm going to stop there and ask probably Dr. Kanungo to answer.
Yeah, so I saw that question there in the chat. It's a complicated question. So starting with the father who had Parkinson's disease, you'd want to know whether or not, like, what age did the father get Parkinson's? What was the specific subtype of disease? Was it a more aggressive form like Lewy body or progressive supranuclear palsy? The latter of which is caused by actually a very different pathophysiology, just kind of looks like Parkinson's. So a lot of different questions to unpack there in terms of figuring out what's the subsequent generation's chance of developing Parkinson's disease. In terms of risk factors, going back to it, the greatest risk factor is simply age. And by the age of 60, approximately 20 to 30% of people will be starting to manifest some signs of Parkinsonism. Every decade that goes up by 10%. Then when you compare that to the relative of a person who had Parkinson's disease, the difference is only about 10% more. So if you're at 60, you had a father with Parkinson's, your risk is about 30 to 40% more. And that scales with every decade. So it doesn't get any worse. Unless, of course, you have a relative with Parkinson's who has early onset Parkinson's and had a genetic mutation found. Let's say they have a LRRK2 mutation, in which case that changes the potential for transmissibility. So it's a pretty complicated question, and it's one you look at on an individual level, right? You take every individual case into account. So that's more along the short of the answer. In terms of getting a diagnostic tool for early detection of Parkinson's disease, obviously, that's what things like Dr. Chanda and Dr. Lee are working towards, is trying to figure out the pathophysiology of the disease and trying to help use that to give us tools that can give us an earlier diagnosis. If we get tools that can make an earlier diagnosis, maybe we can do better studies into looking for disease-modifying therapies. Part of the challenge that we have with disease-modifying therapy trials is that a lot of the people who get enrolled already have a significant degree of Parkinson's disease already. And it would be better to be able to detect a disease-modifying effect if we could see them earlier on in time. But we don't have a tool to sort those people out yet.
Thank you so much for the question, and thank you, Dr. Kanungo. I'm sure there's a lot of people who have found, especially with Parkinson's, does go through their mind, and so thank you for the detailed response. I want to go on to the next question, and I'm just perhaps if Dr. Greenhill can try and answer this one for us. Is the high or low levels of dopamine lead to Parkinson's, and how do these levels change? Dr. Greenhill or Dr. Kanungo, please answer the question. Thank you.
I would just say that probably Dr. Kanungo would be the better person to ask. I'm much more on the interface of technology, and just to complete the previous answer, things that excite me are things like keyboards that recognize that your typing is changing and you may be developing a disease. and flag the question of, hey, maybe you should take this to your doctor, or cameras on your phone, or the number of steps you've taken, the pattern of deviating from normal, alerting you that I have a condition. Those are the kind of things that excite me, and the combination of that with the genomics and proteomics and starting to create that virtual connection around the person, so that you can start tracking some of the information around, are you developing a disease, and then go back and figure out what led to it. That's my area of contribution. But I think Dr. Kanungo, you would be better placed to answer the dopamine questions.
Thank you.
So, I mean, to the best of my understanding, there's never really been a large-scale study looking at cerebral dopamine or dopamine metabolite levels and what that relates to in terms of Parkinson's presentation. I mean, in order to do that study, you need to put in a device that could capture spinal fluid at a regular basis. And then have a device that is sensitive enough to be able to measure the dopamine levels in the spinal fluid, which are very, very small. Newer generation mass spectrometers are getting down to the level where of detection, where it might be possible to do such studies, but then you've got to enroll people with early Parkinson's and convince them to get spinal taps at regular intervals. And that can be a challenge, getting that kind of enrollment into a study like that. So this is why, kind of peripheral detection methods like what Dr. Chanda is trying to develop may actually hold better promise in terms of trying to understand the pathophysiology of how dopamine levels relate to disease progression.
Thank you so much, Dr. Greenhill and Dr. Kanungo. And apart from the questions that are getting posted here, I had a few questions emailed to me in the last couple of days. So thanks to everyone who did that. So one of the questions I have for Dr. Frank Lee is, how can individuals get involved in Parkinson's research, say research that happens in universities?
Yeah, so one of the easiest ways, of course, is to get accepted into a graduate program and reach out to those investigators that are doing Parkinson's disease research. We're always looking for bright, committed individuals that are willing to put the work in and who have shown interest. So I think that's one of the ways that you can contribute to that. You can reach out to any investigator and just start a dialogue and see where you might fit in. This is purely in the academic setting, of course, so that's the only thing I can speak to at this point.
And Dr. Lee, if patients, for instance, want to get involved, or clinicians want to get involved in Parkinson's related disease, what would the process look like?
I think most investigators are amenable or agreeable to have discussions with patients, with clinicians, to explore different avenues of research. And so I think just starting that dialogue is always a good way to start that process.
Thank you. We have two questions that have come that are, I think, sort of in the same, belongs to the same theme, I would say. One of the questions, one of our participants shared that his spouse has advanced Parkinson's and was wondering about the role of CBD oil in Parkinson's treatment. And another question that we have that is also sort of connected is, from my understanding, patients with ADHD who are treated with certain medications may be at higher risk for basal ganglia and cerebellum disorders such as Parkinson's disease. Is there anything those who are on such treatment regimens can do proactively to reduce the risks involved? I'm just leaving it up to one of you to answer the question.
So I think I answered the first question in the chat box there. The answer is we don't know, but there are a couple of movement disorder specialists in Ontario who have enrolled patients into a study to look at the effect of CBD in Parkinson's disease. And so we'll find out, I guess, when they're done their study, if there's a disease modifying effect, and B, whether or not there's any kind of symptomatic advantage to using CBD oil in Parkinson's. So the answer is not really sure. And that's the answer that I give my patients when they ask me this in clinic. For the most part, anecdotally, I don't think the CBD oil can necessarily harm you. It's just whether or not it actually does anything to help you in the management of your disease. We're really, really uncertain about that at this point. The second question, so that's a question based on the production in the 1970s of people who were making MDMA back in the 1970s. They were trying to make ecstasy, and they made an inadvertent side product, and the side product gave them Parkinson's. I've never, unless you're taking massive quantities of amphetamines or methylphenidate, I can't imagine that it's severely toxic enough to the basal ganglia that it would cause Parkinson's disease. I also, of course, follow patients with Tourette's who are on such medications, and they don't have a higher incidence of Parkinson's disease.
Thank you so much for that. We've gotten to quite a few questions here. So one of the questions that was emailed to me this week was research in some parts of the world, especially in India, in the area of Parkinson's research and Ayurvedic treatments, focuses on a commonly used herb, the mucuna seed, which contains natural levodopa and is easily converted to dopamine in the brain. And so the question that was asked is, just like superfoods and nutrients that we all want to take these days, can someone with no symptoms of Parkinson's take this, and would it help in the prevention of Parkinson's?
I guess I'll take that question again. So the thing to remember with all the dopamine agonists, of which the levodopa found in mucinopurians is simply the same thing, they're not disease modifying. So they don't alter the trajectory of if you're going to get Parkinson's, what flavor of Parkinson's you're going to get, or how it's going to progress. So no, the answer is no. If you start taking a bunch of mucinopurians, you'll actually develop toxicity from levodopa. Those of you who have ever seen Michael J. Fox on TV will see what dyskinesia looks like, that excessive movement. So you'll probably just end up looking very dyskinetic. So no, I would not advise that.
Thank you for that. I think, like you said, because of Dr. Google these days, folks have a tendency to, including myself, I'm guilty of it sometimes, going and looking up information. But I think it's really important from what you have said here to really check the facts and get proper advice before one starts to self-medicate or take any kind of, foods that you think might be good to solve a problem that you don't as yet have. There's a question that was posed here connected to CBD, wondering if one of the researchers could attempt an answer here, which is, if someone currently takes CBD oil, has Parkinson's, takes CBD oil, later on, if there's any research whereby you're looking for patients to participate, would that sort of eliminate them from participating in research because of their current usage? Just wondering if
maybe I can, I refer patients to studies all the time, and the key thing with studies is that you need to control the environment of the study. And so you can't give a blanket statement, because it depends on what is the particular aspect that's being examined and what are the criteria for what people are looking for. And if you have many patients, you can make choices and be very strict in your criteria. If you're looking at a patient subset there's not many people to start with, you may accept people that have all kinds of other conditions, because you just need subjects to create statistically valid results. And so it depends. But the one thing that I've practiced now for more than 20 years, and the one thing you see is that there's like a wave. And all of a sudden, even before Dr. Google, people would arrive with their like Reader's Digest article or some sort of a local, and there's like a love affair with one substance, and typically that substance solves everything. And so in the last 5 years, I cannot name a disease to which people have not tried to attach CBD's miraculous treatments. And I wish it was that miraculous, but in real life, to the point that was made earlier from Dr. Chanda about research is it's excruciating, it's long, it's painful, but there is progress because also in the 20 years that I've practiced, so many conditions we've had breakthroughs that we didn't have before. And so the key message that I would send is we need healthy volunteers. We need people affected with Parkinson's at every stage, because the more we discover about these conditions, the more we can help others. And so if I can make a big plea is if you're not sure where to start to sign up for a research trial, the Patient Society is a really good spot to start because they're typically aware of a lot of the studies. Your family physician, the specialty clinics like Dr. Kanungo's or any neurologist will be able to point you in the right direction, and just ask the question. There's always more research trials going on that we have patients. So somebody needs you, they will help you navigate to them.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Greenhill. I have a quick question for Dr. Lee. It seems something that you might have some information on. Could you explain what the C Opn Initiative is, perhaps? And the question is SFU planning to join this initiative?
Yeah, so that's a Canadian Open Parkinson's network, I believe. That's what's the acronym, and it's a I guess a conglomerate of researchers and interested bodies dealing with Parkinson's disease. Is SFU interested in joining? That would be a discussion worth having, and I'm sure there are other investigators at the universities, and it's something that definitely something worth exploring at the university level, and see if we're interested in joining that network. On an individual basis, I'd be interested in joining that, but as a university, I can't speak for the universities.
Thank you for that. I think one of the things that I learned and was quite amazed in preparing for this panel discussion was the number of people and groups and organizations and activists and advocates and companies, wanting to really, really make a difference by collaborating and working together. So to all of you who are involved in this work, thank you so much for that. I have a question, and I'm wondering if Bob could shed some light on this. Bob, one of the questions that we have here is, does massage therapy help people living with the diagnosis of Parkinson's? And I'm just kind of curious if you can share your thoughts or any experiences about the use of therapies such as massage therapy or complementary alternative therapies.
Actually, it's funny you asked me that question, because I know lots of people who do get a lot of benefit from that, but I'm exactly not that person. I'm not crazy about massage therapy, but I do know people who get benefit from it. One thing I would like to mention, though, Sobhana, is the McCuna-Purien's question that came up earlier. I was going to add on to what Dr. Kanungo said, because I actually tried that to self-medicate, basically, and I got the side effects that Dr. Kanungo highlighted, and by backing off of that, they went away, fortunately. However, I think that the gist of what people should think about if they're considering that is just the fact that whatever your source of McCuna is, it's definitely not going to be as consistent and reliable. The amount of L-DOPA that's in the McCuna cannot be relied upon like you can when you're taking standard pharmaceutical carbidopa, levodopa. So, and that's super important to consider, because the side effects the dyskinesias are not pleasant.
Thank you so much for that. Wow, such an incredible participation, and really appreciate all the efforts people have made to send in questions, engage in this conversation, but also give some answers. We have another 5 minutes or so, so I'm going to quickly go to a couple of questions that have just come in. And one is, please comment on deep brain stimulation and research at U of T on monitoring brain activity related to Parkinson. If someone's able to answer the specifics, great, but otherwise, something about deep brain stimulation would be valuable.
So I guess that's a question for myself. So deep brain stimulators are a way of taking control of the circuit that is primarily involved in the movement aspect of Parkinson's disease. It is a measure that we employ when people get to a certain stage in the progression of their disease, when either the symptoms from Parkinson's or the side effects from the medications that they're using to treat the symptoms become quite effective to their quality of life. Another thing that would be in terms of candidacy for a deep brain stimulator, it's a fairly long surgery. You have to be in reasonable health to be able to undergo such a long surgery and be under anesthesia that long. So that's a consideration. And the person has to be cognitively intact as well. Deep brain stimulators can make dementia worse. So we really look to only use those in people who don't have any signs of dementia from Parkinson's. There are 5-6 years ago, there was a lot of work done on early stimulation. So implanting DBSs early in the course of things before people develop the really bad effects of, progressive Parkinson's disease. And overwhelmingly, all those studies showed that early stimulation is really important. It's an issue in BC. We have probably a 2 to 3 year wait list right now to get a DBS implanted. We only have one surgeon who has privileges to perform that surgery and enough funding from the government, I suppose it is, to be able to bring patients in for that elective surgery. And it's an issue that Parkinson's BC and our clinics have been constantly highlighting. By comparison to, say, Ontario, Alberta, Manitoba, BC is considerably lagging behind in terms of meeting the demand for a deep brain stimulator implantation in patients with Parkinson's. So that's my one shout out to, if you're going to get on top of advocacy, getting on top of your MLAs and everything like that to try to increase the supply of elective surgeries like DBS is really important as something that could really help patients here in BC with Parkinson's. With respect to the U of T, I don't specifically know which research trial. They do a lot of research. They have a lot of functional neurosurgeons, and they've all got their research programs. So it would depend on which one you were talking about. I'm familiar with some of their works. Dr. Fasano is a colleague from when I did my PhD at Toronto. So I know what he works on, but there's a lot of other people who work on functional neurosurgery there. So I'm not sure how to answer that question.
Thank you so much. I think it's really valuable what you've just added to this conversation. I think due to just a sheer lack of time, we're not able to get into the issue of wait list, the small number of specialists versus the number of patients who need their expertise and care. And we have a fragmented healthcare system right now, which makes things very, very difficult, especially for the person who is suffering symptoms or needs to get a diagnosis, which takes me to one of our last questions to Dr. Greenhill. So Dr. Greenhill, when we were chatting the other day, you talked about your vision for reimagining and transforming, complex healthcare systems, such as healthcare. So how do we ensure that when we reimagine and transform complex healthcare systems, that we ensure patient voices and their lived experiences inform the process, along with experts who are actually involved in either research or in providing clinical care? How do we go from a fragmented system to a comprehensive, integrated system that truly puts the patient at the center?
And thank you for that question. And I think for the last 20 years, I've worked within the system to try and get the decision makers and all the people involved, stakeholders, as we call them, aligned. And I've concluded that we are all very aligned, but what was actually missing is a technical backbone. The reason why we can have this webinar right now is because we're using a technology tool to provide a video connection. And before that, we communicated by email. And my email system could talk to your system and everyone else's, and we could transmit that information seamlessly. And so one of our first adopters at Careteam called this, finally I'm given the tool to do what we've all agreed should be happening, which is us collaborating on the same level. And that collaboration was first imagined by Canada Health Infoway and governments as a top-down, everybody will adopt exactly the same system. And that's just not achieved, and it's not realistic, because every province, every hospital has decided their own choice of technology to use their own systems for documenting care, scheduling care, and we need to start creating something that's connective tissue across all of that and says, keep your existing tool, but let's enable a better conversation that needs to respect privacy and security, but also needs to enable that type of a conversation, the right information, the right time. Some of the early efforts was, let's just put everything in the same place. Well, I had a patient transfer over recently, 348 pages in a PDF about them. I can't consume that much information, even if I had a week. And so how can I find the right information about the right person at the right moment and be able to ensure that the person knows what's being shared about them, can participate and weigh in. They can add information from their smart home around the smart scale and any devices that they're using, and combine all of that into something that the experts can then interpret and provide feedback on. And the point that Susan made at the very beginning is the importance of involving others. So many of us have relatives who don't live close to us anymore. The statistic was that 50% of elderly today don't have a living relative within a 100-kilometer radius. And under COVID, even if they live next door, they would still need to do it virtually if we are to respect public health. And so how can we take a technology layer? And that's one of the things we're doing on Careteam, is saying everyone needs to be coordinated the way an orchestra only functions if everyone knows what is the score you're playing and who is the conductor. And that is something that is achievable, but it requires a number of people to change their minds, to stop talking about that, like, yes, one day we'll accomplish this, but get this urgency of they're real people who are suffering right now. And how can we make that possible? How can we take the 50% of doctors who are burnt out and make it easier for them to do what they trained to do and what they love doing, which is provide patient care? And the answer may be advocacy, because we've agreed with the status quo for too long. And we need to start saying that's not good enough. Good enough is not good enough.
Thank you very much for those powerful words and your passion, much appreciated. We are unfortunately coming to the end of what's been a very, very interesting, engaging, and candid conversation, I would say, and I can't thank you all enough for making the time to be here. I'm going to now request our esteemed panelists to take 30 seconds each to give some kind of a concluding thought. What's most hopeful looking forward, and what's the urgent need of the day? Could we start this wrap up with Dr. Frank Lee?
Great, thank you. It's been a great discussion, and I would like to lead with saying that although I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of failed experiments that lead to positive results, I think positive results are coming. And with the advent of new technologies and accessible technologies, I think we can get to the answer to the questions that we have that we weren't able to address earlier. I think I'm still very hopeful. We're still a bit of a ways away in trying to identify the root cause of Parkinson's disease, but I think we are slowly getting there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. Dr. Chanda.
I think I want to leave the discussion with the note that our group, including many other groups in the world, working towards various devices which can enable doctors and practitioners to diagnose Parkinson at early onset, which I think we heard multiple times, and come out with a better prognosis and better treatment plan. So with that hope that we are all working and look like better collaboration in coming years will make it a reality one day sooner.
Thank you, Dr. Chanda. Susan.
Thank you, Sobhana. I'm really excited looking south of the border and watching what President Biden is doing with championing the caregivers and addressing what they call the caregiver crisis. So men as well, but the bulk of the caregiving being put on women who are have careers, they have parents, they have children, they have maybe loved ones who are ill, and how to wrap care coordination supports and bringing together and empowering some of the biggest foundations and universities to address and empower the patient and the caregiver. So
thank you so much, Susan. A good point to cover here today. Dr. Greenhill.
The part that I'm most excited about is probably the bridging that is starting to happen between clinical and research. We used to think of research as purely, let's do a clinical trial and follow a number of patients. But if these virtual tools that I've described become commonplace, we can shorten that cycle and create a learning system so that you can get lab results, genomics, observable things from wearables and devices combined with how does the patient feel, what has their spouse and partner, what they have noticed. And so we can complete that 360 of data around the patient and start pulling insights a lot faster. And remember that sometimes we're looking at just the Parkinson's disease, but who is the person behind that? And also what other diseases do they have that add or multiply or change or transform either the condition itself or the treatments. So getting that data-driven combination of clinical and research in real time is within the next decade.
Thank you so much. That's definitely something to be very hopeful about. Dr. Kanungo?
Yeah, so I agree with all the comments made by everyone. I do think that we're moving towards an era where we'll better understand the pathophysiology of the disease and either how to interrupt it or how to get around it. And so I do think that that's something that's maybe achievable within our lifetimes. And, you know, I also agree with the sentiment that the ability for researchers to collaborate with clinicians, to collaborate holistically from country to country, province to province, country to country, is much more improved, particularly with embracing things like virtual technology that, yes, we've been asking the government and beating our heads against the wall for a long time to get the governments to accept, right? And then all of a sudden we have this pandemic and now they accept it very easily. So I do think that's coming. I do think there'll be better collaboration in the future.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Kanungo. And last but not the least, Bob.
Thanks, Shobna, and thank you very much again for hosting this panel. I'm a tech optimist. I believe in innovation as a path to better care for people with Parkinson's. So I just really want to thank all the innovators on the panel today for your time and contribution, and especially to all the guests in the audience, especially those with Parkinson's, for taking the time to join us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. We are coming to the end of this panel discussion, and thank you so much again for your comments, questions, participation, and for just sharing the wisdom and experiences that all of you have. I want to take a moment to thank my awesome team members, Lud Brink of External Relations, Heidi Kwong and Jessica Chang of Events and Ceremonies, and all the folks who supported from the back end, and to all the panelists for making time from your busy schedules to be here today and to try and break down some of the silos that we have, which is a huge barrier for integrated and for meaningful systems of care for individuals. So today's panel, I think all of you will agree, not only deepened our understanding about Parkinson's, but also impressed upon us that we must act on many fronts collaboratively to make sure that there are long overdue systemic changes that happen sooner rather than later, and that patient experiences, clinical practices, and research impacts and influences and coexist together in our system. So thank you once again, and let's make a commitment to unite for Parkinson's and stay well.
Thank you.